Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Today we are talking Germany's new government, what the world can expect in a post-Merkel era. I'm joined by Dr. Ed Turner. Ed, how is it going to begin with?
Well, it's a really exciting time in Germany. I mean, we've gone from a situation where the Social Democrats were polling third to a situation where they are now fielding the next Chancellor. So exciting times.
So leaders of Germany's Social Democrats, that's the SDP, Greens and the Liberals, have reached a deal on their coalition agreement for government. So it does bring an end of an era for Angela Merkel. She's been there a very, very long time, and she's seen quite a few British prime ministers come and go over that period as well.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, Angela Merkel, of course, became Chancellor in 2005. She is a politician that has been consistently underestimated throughout her career. I mean, she saw off a number of male bigwigs in order to reach the top, who didn't anticipate that she could do it. There are all sorts of dreadful sexist phrases used about her at the time. Kohl's little girl, for example, was one term used about her when she was a minister under Helmut Kohl. And instead, she's outlasted the lot of these characters and has proven in my estimation, a very effective leader. So it'll be a hard act to follow.
So this agreement has been put in place. It's the product of a negotiation by 22 working groups with around 300 participants from those three parties, and that's at a national and state level as well. It includes a detailed programme for the government to follow. The parties still need to sign off on the deal. But like I say, it's all done and dusted, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So actually the parties have now signed off, and it was just as we expected. So in the case of the Social Democrats, I think 98% of those voting at their conference supported it. The Liberals 92%, and the Greens had a ballot of their members, and it was in the high 80s. So yeah, there's strong support from the parties taking part. And as I say, that means Olaf Schultz is Chancellor, and the government's been formed. And Germany looks forward to a new era in its politics. I mean, worth maybe as well just pointing out that German parties take their policy documents very seriously. The fact you have 177 pages of dense prose explaining what the coalition will do after 300 people have had an input, is a sharp contrast to the United Kingdom, where I think the Conservative Lib Dem coalition agreement was less than a tenth as long as that.
It was strange, wasn't it? I think everybody in Germany, when that happened in 2010, was going, how do you do it so quickly? We're supposed to be the efficient ones. But I mean, you can take what you like from the following 5 years and the Tory rule ever since.
Well, that's it. I think there is something where they see this as a program of work. They see this as a kind of business plan for the government, and so the recent times have been really important for people trying to understand what policies are going to be pursued. One other thing which was quite interesting about the process was that these three different parties, or specifically the SPD and the Greens, are quite closely aligned on many things, but the Free Democrats, the Liberals, are more removed from them, are further away from them ideologically. They seem to get on well in the negotiations. There were very, very few leaks coming out, whereas when the Christian Democrats, the Greens and the Liberals tried to negotiate and failed 4 years ago, there were constant leaks, there were constant tweets, there were constant barbed comments. Instead, it's been a very professional show.
Let's have a look at the document, which is entitled Dare More Progress, Alliance of Freedom, Justice and Sustainability. Talk to us about it.
Yeah, so I suppose the starting point is when you've got three parties coming together, what can they do? And when they disagree on a lot, you might end up with the lowest common denominator. So you might end up with something which is broadly quite stable, not much changing. I think they would say that they instead have allowed each party and its goals to shine through, and there's more substance here than you might have expected. Some critical analysts have said there's not enough detail on some points. There's probably some truth in that. But particularly on some of the social questions, the parties are quite well aligned. And so there's quite a lot of ambition there. So there's some liberalisation of Germany's immigration rules, making it more quickly possible for people seeking asylum to work, for example, opening up new routes for people to come to Germany, decriminalisation of cannabis, or indeed legalisation of cannabis in some settings is another one. A much mooted reform of abortion law is a third. So in areas where there's a good fit between between the parties anyway. There's quite a lot there. And then there is other things which are important for each of the parties. Each one, as I say, has been allowed to set its own accents. So, just to take an example, but we can talk more about this, on climate, bringing forward Germany's exit from coal to 2030, and some pretty major investments planned. That's clearly something which the Greens were after. For the Social Democrats, €12 an hour minimum wage, big increase. That was their kind of headline election pledge, and they're seeing that through. And there are also some other changes on welfare policy which they wanted. And for the Free Democrats, they've secured no increase in tax rates, which was important for them, and the return from 2023 to balanced budgets.
It does seem like a piece of trickery, doesn't it, to not raise taxes but also invest really quite heavily in green infrastructure going forward?
Well, a piece of trickery is interesting. I mean, Germany has fiscal rules in the constitution, which was suspended in response to the COVID pandemic, and there was provision for them to do that. I think what they're going to do is use every possibility they can to generate investment without increasing the debt burden. Some of that will involve Germany's State Investment Bank, which is actually an entity which people have looked on with some admiration from the United Kingdom. They'll also look at ways of levering in private investment and generally raising the funds. That being said, it's not going to be easy, and I think in practice, the speed at which the German and the wider European and global economies recover will determine how successful they are on this front.
There was an interesting note that you made that if enough votes are found in Parliament, they could change the constitution, and the voting age for parliamentary election will be reduced to 16.
Yeah, so they're looking to do that for European elections anyway, but if they can change the basic law, they'll reduce the voting age to 16. Also, there were some elements actually of direct democracy that they were looking to introduce. So having citizens' assemblies take place to advise parliamentarians on particular issues in the federal parliament. Again, that's part of their kind of social reforming agenda. And I do think the mantra that they've used in this coalition is about modernisation. It's about saying that, and an implicit contrast, I suppose, with the stability of the Merkel years, saying now we're going to do something different. We're going to have some bold change. And I think those suggestions, like reducing the voting age, they're an important symbol there.
And Olaf Schultz, tell me more about him.
Oh, I mean, Scholz is an interesting character, and I've been fortunate enough to encounter him in person in the course of my work. He's very smart. He's got a tremendous work ethic. He reads very, very widely. One of the things which you're struck by when you hear him speak is just how well informed he is and how widely read he is. When I saw him, he was giving a talk at a British university, and he spoke well, and then he did an hour's question and answer session in English with a whole range of topics, and was very, 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 very accomplished. He's been he's fulfilled various important roles. He was governing mayor of Hamburg before becoming a federal finance minister. He was Labour and Social Affairs minister under the previous German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. So he's done big jobs before. He's meant to be a very, very successful negotiator. He's someone who tends to think and work things through before announcing what will happen. Maybe he's a lawyer by training, and maybe that comes through. He tends to have a very sort of soothing, calm demeanour, not particularly colourful. And indeed, that was probably part of the attraction for German voters, that in some ways he looked like a sort of continuity Merkel figure, calm, analytical, quite dry. But an impressive character. And I think we've seen through some of his actions in the pandemic, particularly the initiative around setting up the European Recovery Fund, which was a real groundbreaking moment in the development of European Union policy and economic integration, and also on the agreement on minimum global rates of corporate taxation, that he's someone who is able to kind of grapple with big policy challenges and bring people together from a disparate range of views.
When we were maybe 2015, 2016, and around the time of the EU referendum in Britain, I think many comparisons were drawn with Germany. How different do you think the roads those two nations are on at the moment is?
Well, I mean, clearly, the UK government's relationship with the European Union after Brexit is a difficult and somewhat antagonistic one. And we can maybe think about what the new government means for that, the new government in Germany. By contrast, in Germany, and for Olaf Schultz, as for all of the new cabinet, commitment to European integration is hardwired into German sort of political DNA. And so when you see a difficult policy challenge, you think, do we need more powers for the European Union? Do we need to cooperate more to solve it? Whereas the British government's lens is sort of a different one. How can we set about solving it ourselves? And so, that starting point, really makes a difference. I mean, it's worth, maybe it's worth just reflecting on things Olaf Schultz said about Britain. Both in encounters I've had when I've heard him speak, but also in sort of public television appearances. He's clearly pretty critical of the UK government's choices around European policy, and I think will be less patient than Angela Merkel was with some of our foibles.
In terms of maybe looking at predictions and what you think may happen, is that these things normally do 9 times out of 10 start out pretty rosy. Everybody's on the same page and looking forward to working together. Do you think there will be stumbling blocks on the way, though? Because so far it does look like the perfect situation for the nation of Germany.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. So you've got your 177 pages, but there are, then events just happen. So already there's been a bit of a brouhaha, a relatively minor one, between the Greens and Liberals, where the Liberal transport minister looked to be doing things to promote diesel cars, which was obviously not what the Greens had in mind for their transport policy. And you'll see those little things coming up. Of course, also Germany has quite regular regional elections, and run up to regional elections, the parties will be doing their things to support their profile, and then you'll kind of get little conflicts there. I think the bigger thing as well is then when unforeseen things happen, crises emerge, and that'll be a real challenge. So, for example, if we imagine that there is a major incident of Russian aggression, let's say, the parties have different instincts in relations policy on Russia. The Greens are very sort of hardline, very hawkish, very critical of the Russian government. The Social Democrats are, by instinct, much more cautious and much more set upon dialogue. Well, if it really kicked off, for example, on the border with Ukraine, then that's the sort of thing which could send the two parties into spin. Or if we saw a pressure on Germany to take many more refugees all of a sudden, then you could imagine left-wing Social Democrat parliamentarians and Greens pushing for a more open approach in relation to refugees and asylum seekers, and that then being resisted by other parts of the government. So, it's absolutely right that these things could become difficult. And also, as I say, just the pace at which the German and European and global economies recover is going to play into how much the government can fulfil its ambitions.
And when we look at it as a whole, I don't know if we could put it maybe into terms that maybe a British audience would understand how this coalition works and what it would maybe look like if it was happening here, sort of what those groups of parties would be.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we'll start with the continuity bit. I mean, Olaf Schultz and Social Democrats do look quite like the British Labour Party. There are fewer sort of left-wing Corbynista elements, so they are there as well, because there are also other parties competing on the left in Germany. But that's that is a comparable organisation. The German Greens are more centrist than the British Greens. They're also more important. We're talking about a party that's got dozens of MPs rather than just one. But for example, the fact the Greens have signed up to having armed drones available to German armed forces in this coalition agreement is the sort of thing you just wouldn't get, I think, from British Greens. They're more pragmatic. And actually, the German Greens have been tilting pretty consistently towards the centre ground in recent years. There used to be a balance between the party's left and the party's more moderate elements, and now
that's where you win power, isn't it? Whoever takes over the centre 9 times out of 10 will win power, and I suppose that's the difference between why a British Labour Party and a British Green Party are nowhere near it.
Well, that's a view. I suppose others will push back and say it's also about shaping the views of the electorate. But the Greens, I think, particularly have seen potential in attracting former Christian Democrat voters and have done that pretty successfully in some places. So, for example, in this could be in the southwest of Germany, Baden-Württemberg, it used to be a very strongly Christian Democratic state. It's now run by the Greens, and they've done that by sort of fusing an environmental with quite a socially conservative appeal. So they do look like a creature that's pivoted towards the centre ground, has done so quite successfully. The Liberals are not, I think, although they used to be in a European Parliament group with the Liberal Democrats in the UK until we left the EU. They're more economically right wing. There's more of an emphasis on low taxes, on keeping public spending down. Then they kind of try to emphasize what they would call sort of future topics like digitalization in particular, and its potential to transform public services. They do have some social liberal views, but really those, I think, are subordinate to the appeal towards economic liberalism. So probably the FDP are more like a certain economically liberal wing of the Conservative Party than they are the Lib Dems. And that's where the challenge is, because the FDP, for example, say the solution on climate change is not to have more regulation. You need just market-based incentives. For the Greens, it would absolutely be about regulatory interventions by government to reduce carbon emissions. And so, those are some of the areas where it's been quite challenging.
It's been quite a big year, I suppose, for those of a green persuasion. COP26, of course, held in Glasgow this year. Do you think this is the start of more green representation at a national level, more across Europe, and sort of Germany look to be leading the way on this?
Well, it's of course not unique, and actually in Austria the Greens are also in government with Christian Democrats there. So it has happened before, but I'm sure it's right that as consciousness of the climate challenge increases, there is a political opportunity for green parties there, and also green parties will, I think, take the lessons from Germany in particular, which is looked on at quite often from abroad, and think, well, there is an opportunity to get into government and shape things. So that's quite probably right. I think there's also something about the challenge for Social Democrats here, that Social Democrats have notoriously found it hard keeping different sections of their support base together, and some of that's tended to fragment and go off in green directions.
Perfect, Ed. Is there anything else that you want to add on to that, or leave it there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just one reflection about what this means for the United Kingdom. I mean, maybe that's important. We've touched Definitely, on this, but there are a couple of paragraphs in the coalition agreement about relations with the UK, and they're pretty no nonsense, and the language is pretty firm. And they say that if the UK government backtracks on the Northern Ireland Protocol, then there will be consequences. And really, the bilateral relationship with Germany needs to be seen in the context of Germany being a member of the European Union, and so there's a clear kind of firm message there: no divide and rule. Now, it seems to me that in mediating the UK's relationship with the EU, Germany has tried to find compromises, tried to bring people together. I think there's some sympathy for that stance amongst the Free Democrats, the Liberals in the new German government, but they're not really in the key ministries. I think it will be a pretty chill wind from Social Democrats and Greens, and I think they will be less understanding of UK government ministers if they're challenging towards the EU, and if they're looking to depart from texts which have been agreed, and Germany will adopt really quite a firm stance there. So I think that's one area where we will probably feel something quite immediate as a result of new government being formed.
Really, really interesting, isn't it? Because these things aren't just going to disappear after a while. They are intricate pieces of policy that involve a lot of countries and a lot of documents.
That's absolutely right, and and it won't just affect us, by the way, as well. I mean, another area where there's really strong language in the coalition agreement is about EU member states where there are questions over their commitment to the rule of law. They don't mention Poland and Hungary by name, but that's who's meant. And traditionally, Germany has been quite focused on trying to find compromise, trying to kind of dampen down disagreements. And certainly, I think the instincts of the Greens in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, but also quite possibly elements in the Chancellery as well, under Olaf Schultz, will be less patient with that. So there are a whole range of these quite thorny issues which confront our continent at the moment, where the new government will have an impact.
Incredibly interesting. Well, Ed, I believe you're on Twitter, aren't you?
Nah.
You're not. You don't bother with Twitter? No, I don't blame you. Actually,
well, no, lurking
in the background. Excellent. Well, we'll say goodbye to Dr. Ed Turner. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll hopefully catch up with you soon.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye.